As all of you already know, my father was a kind and giving man, and I am blessed enough to have him as my father. I had almost 30 years with this incredible man, and I would like to share some of my fondest memories with you. When I was growing up after church on Sundays, my dad would make what I called daddy sandwiches, which were open-faced melted cheese sandwiches with mustard and deli meat on them, and sometimes pickles. He would make them in the microwave while blasting classical music from the speakers in our living room. He listened to music a lot and introduced me to everything from the classics like Chopin to Steely Dan and Brazilian jazz. He was a talented musician, playing the upright bass as a child and playing the tuba and singing in choir later in life. When he was in college, my Uncle Paul would boast that my dad played for Penn State, his cousin, and would then proudly exclaim he played tuba in the blue band at the Penn State Marching Band. Summers growing up, we knew Dad was home from work when we heard the sounds of NPR coming from his car and the rumble of the Porsche coming down the driveway. And once in a while, on a Sunday evening in the summer, we would all pile into the car and head to Rhoda Springs to have ice cream for dinner. As we grew up, my dad always managed to balance his work and family, even if that meant driving directly from work after a long day to one of my concerts or performances. Once he almost missed one of my performances senior year in high school because the sperm missed the plane. Yes, that's right. The sperm missed the plane. As one of the veterinarians for the Roger Williams Park Zoo, he had a lot of interesting jobs, including operating on polar bears and monkeys, and occasionally helping to artificially inseminate an elephant. The Saturday of my concert, he planned to drive to the zoo in the morning in Providence, help with the elephant, and drive back home with plenty of time to shower and get ready before heading over to my concert. Unfortunately, things did not go as planned, and the elephant's sperm missed the plane. And he was at the zoo for much longer than anticipated. He did make it to my concert in time, although he did have the faint smell of elephant on his clothes. It's the life of a child of a veterinarian. After I graduated from college, my dad and I took a road trip to Los Angeles, where I was planning to work for a year. In the mornings while we were on the road, he would bring me coffee in bed because he knew I needed coffee to start my day. We stopped in Yellowstone National Park for a few days, and I got to experience the beauty of the park for the first time. And there was only one time where he really scared me, climbing over a beaver dam to get a better view of a waterfall for a picture. When I wanted to go to graduate school and get my master's in education, he put off retiring for a year so he could pay for my education, making sure I could attend the school I wanted to attend and that I would graduate debt-free. Last fall, my mom and dad worked tirelessly to help plan and pay for my wedding to my husband, Kevin, and we could not have asked for a more special day. He was able to walk me down the aisle, and we shared a very special father-daughter dance to the Beatles song, "In My Life." The last line of that song is, "In my life, I love you more," and those words could not be more true.
So, I get to eulogize a legend. No pressure. Okay, so thank you all so much for coming today. It's wonderful to see so many friends, old and new. My family and I truly appreciate it. But before I begin, I have a brief disclaimer, and that's that this is not going to be particularly somber. This is not going to be a tearjerker. My goal in the next several minutes is to celebrate my dad by remembering some quintessential components of his personality, qualities and characteristics that sort of have permeated all of his relationships and remained a constant throughout his life. And my hope is that while you may not share these exact memories with me, these stories that I'm about to recall will help you remember a specific time where his presence, his friendship, and his compassion enriched your life. So let's begin. I'm first going to focus on what I will call Dad's nearly pathologic intellectual curiosity. So I suppose everyone that knows at this point in time, based on the elephant smell story that Lily just said, that Dad was a veterinarian. But not everyone here knows that it's actually much harder to get into veterinary school than medical school. And not only did he attend vet school, but he graduated from what is arguably the best veterinary school in the country. Now, after graduation, most veterinarians go directly into practice without doing any more training. But instead of doing that, Dad decided to get not one, but 2 subspecialty board certifications, each of which has a passing rate of a little bit less than 40%, so it's pretty easy. And so now, after he's done with training, he goes on to join the faculty at Brown University. Maybe you've heard of that place. Where he goes on to one might describe as a relatively illustrious career. And then what does he do on the weekends for fun, to relax? Well, as if having one incredibly involved, stressful job wasn't enough, he decides to become a volunteer fireman. And then he went to paramedic school. And so at this point in time, he's got 1 bachelor degree, 1 doctoral degree, 2 subspecialty board certifications, and the ability to stop your house from burning down and bring you back to life if you're dying all at the same time. So fast forward to my 5th year in residency. This is after he's already had 2 strokes. He's like 50% of the way there. And he calls just to check in. So this is going to be me. Hi, Dad. Yeah, no, sorry I can't talk for too long. No, I'm trying to get ready for this pediatric sarcoma resection we're doing at MGH. Yeah, no, it's going to be hard. Dad, oh God, I hope you aren't planning on using an endoprosthesis. Those things have a terrible track record. Excuse me? Yeah, didn't the latest paper quote something like a greater than 100% complication rate? How did you know that? And his dad, it's not like a secret. It was in this month's JBJS. Okay, good. So I'll stop there. For those of you that don't know, JBJS, or the Journal of Bone and Joint Surgery, is the most acclaimed scientific journal in orthopedics. And so in order to actually understand it, you either need to be an orthopedic surgeon or have the intellectual curiosity and mental firepower of a titan. And Dad had both of those in spades. So I suppose then that given his intellectual curiosity, we shouldn't really be surprised that he was adventurous in general, which brings me to my second trait, Dad's love of adventure, which at many times seemed a little bit less like love of adventure and more like abject disregard for rules or general safety. So you may be thinking to yourself, now, I don't know about that. He was pretty straight-laced. He was an Eagle Scout. Oh, really? How about this? So a picture hangs in our house from my parents' honeymoon. It's out there right now as well. Dad is standing, smiling, leaning on a sign on the side of the road, overlooking what amounts to this like cavernous drop. And the sign reads very clearly, "Danger, do not go beyond this point." That point is the railing that he has blatantly stepped over to take the picture. Jeez. Okay. And I've got plenty more where that came from. Oh, yeah. When we were in Boy Scouts, we went to Philmont, which is, if you don't know, this massive ranch in the mountains of New Mexico. And Dad decided we could handle what was described as a moderately strenuous itinerary, which included a 12,000-foot peak climb, which unfortunately is prone to freak snowstorms in the middle of the summer. So, guess who woke up to 6 inches of snow on the ground in July? Yay, great. Do you know how hard it is to descend a mountain covered in snow for a troop of 14-year-old boys and their overweight, middle-aged dads with absolutely no cold weather gear? It's not pretty. And so when we finally reached the next campsite, the other 2 dads in our trip laid down and cried themselves to sleep. And Dad is sitting there on his pack picking the peanuts out of the trail mix while the rest of the guys try to set up camp in the dark. And then he went back 9 years later and 50 pounds heavier and did the exact same thing. And if that's not enough to convince you, who in this room, I'd like a show of hands, has had the inglorious pleasure of riding in the passenger seat of what he referred to as the little car? Yeah, sorry about that. I always loved it when my parents came home after a drive and Mom looked like she'd just been stuck in a wind tunnel with her hair just blown back and her eyes taped like that. He loved pushing the limits. He loved adventure, and he was a shining example of the fact that you can be a Boy Scout and a bit of a rebel all at the same time and be all the better for it.
Yes.
So, now that I've lulled you into a false sense of security, this is going to be fun. It's going to get a little bit more serious. What Dad did as well or better than anyone else I've ever known was to be supportive. And that may sound a little trite, but in reflecting back on my entire life, I can't think of a single instance where I said, hey, Dad, it'd be really kind of cool and interesting if we did X. And he said, no, that sounds like a bad idea. Of course, he said no like a lot, plenty of times, but never to a dream or an aspiration. And as busy and focused and driven as he was with his own endeavors, the goals and aspirations of those around him universally trumped his own. And when I wanted to survey every house in town for the correct housing numbering for my Eagle project, he drove that aforementioned little car around town in second gear while I took copious notes. Yeah, you probably heard us go by. Do you know how painful it must have been to do that? To drive that car 15 miles an hour day after day in the blazing heat of the summer? I don't know how he didn't cook the clutch in doing that. Or how about the time that Beth and I wanted our dog Holden and some special beverages at our wedding in South Carolina? Dad drove 18 hours in a rented minivan with our dog and a cargo full of contraband in the back, effectively smuggling Wachusett beer over what I counted as 9 state lines. It's like 9 felonies. And he arrived in Charleston, and his only complaint was that the speed limit in North Carolina was 75 miles an hour, not 80 like it was supposed to be. So no matter what the idea, scheme, or goal, he never criticized you. He was always your greatest advocate. And there was never any thought to personal discomfort or inconvenience. And that is true selflessness. That is a belief in and love for your fellow human beings, and for the fact that for him, that was just normal. It was a given. It is amazing. And that supportive quality of his personality was a constant in every relationship that he had. But to me, the most endearing, the most important, the most quintessential trait my dad possessed was his devotion. Devotion to his family, devotion to his friends, to his patients, his coworkers, and his students. And above all else that we've talked about today, that was his gift. So I've told quite a few stories today, so please indulge me with one more. And this story is really a microcosm of my relationship with my father. Many of you know that Eleanor's arrival into this world was a little scary. Not dissimilar from Edward's. She was scheduled to arrive via C-section because despite all our best efforts, she was breech and delivery would have been a little dangerous. However, instead of sticking to the script, she decided to arrive a day early without warning in the middle of the night. And remember, at this point in time, Beth and I have a 20-month-old and 2 dogs need to be cared for, and we can't just drop everything and leave the house at the drop of a hat. So in that moment, my first and really only instinct was to call Dad. And it's a 10-second phone call, the synopsis of which was the following: we need you, like, now. Click. 34 minutes later, he arrived. And I timed it. So to give you some perspective on that, the distance from the house in Sterling to our house in Boston is 54.5 miles, which means after he hung up the phone, he averaged 97 miles an hour until he walked in the door. Like, that's true. That's unsafe, yeah. And again, upon arrival, our conversation was incredibly brief. It was, you go take care of Beth, I'll take care of everything else. And he did. And there was never any doubt in my mind that everything that had happened, incredible as it was, land speed record and all, wouldn't happen. He wasn't going to fail. He couldn't. And it was as if there was some universal law that made it that way, like gravity or the sunrise. If you needed him, he was going to be there, and he would make everything okay. And he did. And so after we stopped laughing at the way he wore his socks over his pants, or how he brought Diet Coke to parties, or how he thought speed limits were like suggestions, we will remember his unfailing devotion to us. We will remember how with every fiber of his being, he was there for us, all of us, doing whatever he could to help. Not because he expected something in return, not because he needed a project, but because he couldn't not be there to help. It was woven into the core of his spirit. It was what made him Jim Harper. And consciously or not, he dedicated his entire life to that end. So your presence, here today is a testament to that devotion. And there's no better way to remember him, to honor him, than to practice that devotion in our own lives. Today, I'm not, as you can see, particularly sad. I'm not grieving. I'm merely holding on to a hope that I can pass on the ceaseless love and devotion that he showed to me, to those that I love. And I would encourage you to do the same. For in doing that, his memory will live on within us forever. Amen. It's a good eulogy, right?
Preach. I gave him the task of writing a remembrance, and he sent me that, and I was like, that's a eulogy, Carl. Please join me, rise as you are able, and join me in singing Amazing Grace. To everything there is a season and a time for every purpose under heaven. That was Jim's favorite Bible passage. He even wanted Turn, Turn, Turn played at his reception, so you will hear that later. Remember that song? To everything, turn, 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 right. He was a boomer. It is the reading that was read at Lily Harper's wedding. After Jim walked her down that aisle right there, I still have that picture in my head. I was wearing the same outfit. Robin made this stole for Lily's wedding, just for Lily's wedding, so I wore it today for Jim's service. That was a time to embrace, a time to sow, a time to plant, a time to build up, a time to dance. And today is a time to mourn, a time to weep, a time to break down and build up again, a time to love. It is also a time to pluck up what has been planted, for as you just heard from Carl, Jim's roots go deep into the soil, deep into the heart of this little town, deep into this precious church community that he adored, deep into this beautiful family and extended family. The love he has planted here will endure forever, just like God's love endures forever. I have been blessed to be with the Harpers over the past 5 years in many different seasons, through both death and grief and celebration. And I love them more than most human beings. So I too am a mourner today. I too am saying goodbye to a friend. Jim was one of the first parishioners to warmly welcome me as the new clueless pastor of this church, and to give me the lay of the land, and to tell me when I was messing up. I have learned over the years that he was the first welcomer for countless First Church parishioners over the decades. He knows every old person in this church, and he knows every new person in this church, too. He stood at that back door and just welcomed anybody that he had never met before. He made it his business, too. He was the first person to have the grace to tell me what I was doing wrong in my first year as well. You always knew where you stood with Jim. And Robin was one of the first people to tell me everything I was doing right. Because you always know where you stand with Robin, too. And almost everyone stands in the light of her love. I am so lucky to know you. Jim has a distinguished resume, to be sure, but here at First Church, this gentle giant is known primarily as the caretaker for our babies and toddlers in the nursery that we call the Kinderwatch. For the last almost 20 years, every single Sunday, he has sat in that rocking chair with those little kids, with his friend Kevin Moulton, who is sitting over there. Everybody always thinks it's so fascinating that we have two men who have been in that nursery for so long, loving those kids. He was always taking care of the smallest, the weakest, the most fragile and vulnerable. Though his job suggested otherwise, his calling was never to fancy degrees or prestigious careers. His call was to save lives, to stand up for the least of these, as Jesus teaches. He presented his very body as a living sacrifice to our God, who we know only as love. Jim was a lifelong follower of Jesus. He went to Christian camp with his family, his huge family that's all here today. He was a big-time Methodist, like big. His childhood consisted of just partying at Sunday school picnics and playing the stand-up bass in the school band and the Boy Scouts, where he achieved Eagle Scout and Order of the Arrow. He was super cool, obviously. Not a dork at all. His father was strict, and his mother was known for her red beet deviled eggs at church picnics, which he hated. And they were a church family, the whole family. Uncle John was even the treasurer of the World Methodist Church, for God's sake. So Jim wouldn't even join First Church in Sterling. He came here, but he wouldn't join until the last uncle died, because he wanted to respect them by not, denouncing his Methodist faith. And he tithed in 2 churches that whole time. He went to Penn State for undergrad, University of Pennsylvania School of Vet Medicine, graduating in 1972, and then he was in the Army. But his call led him to care for the most vulnerable again and again and again and again. So after leaving the Army, he went to Panama on a civil service position where he delivered babies and researched in malaria. And Jim loved dogs so much. He loved them as much as his people. He had a yellow lab named Sherry when Robin first met him. I understand it was after the song, Sherry Baby. It was such a boomer. It's all the greatest hits, right? She was completely hand signal trained, she didn't need any kind of leash or whatever. She just did she just did whatever you said with your hands, and she did it. And she was from Panama, so she was a warm-blooded lab, and she needed to be very warm at night, so she slept between Robin and Jim on the bed, and Robin married him anyway. A lifelong lover of animals and a veterinarian, Jim cared for the most vulnerable and smallest among us. He saved so many animals' lives. He also helped them die peacefully and with dignity. His family marvels in the fact that he put down all of his family's animal companions himself when it was their time to leave this world too, a final act of deep and abiding love for them that most of us could never do. Jim was always willing to show up. Jim saved countless human lives as well, and trained other people to save countless more. Raise your hand if you were trained by Jim and the paramedics. Well, raise them high. I know you're trying to be ceremonial, but you can still raise your hands. A lot of you. Jim was a devoted and tireless paramedic in Sterling, literally in his spare time, and trained perhaps most of the paramedic and EMT force, refusing to take a paycheck for the thousands of on-call hours he worked. They had to give him $1 for tax purposes, and he just gave that $1 back to the department when he was done with it. So one of the paramedics we spent time with in the hospital took advantage of Jim's desire to help and always asked him to take his on-call shifts when he went out on dates. But because Jim was always willing to show up, he was always the right person to call. As his cousin Susan says, Jim was sometimes a pain in the butt, but it was usually for good reason. His colleague Moses said that they would butt heads on things sometimes, but it was almost always because Jim would be advocating ferociously for even the smallest creatures they worked with, like the mice. Jim was particularly proud of the work he did at Ground Zero after September 11th, saving the lives of first responders and their canine companions, caring for them in New York City, searching for bodies among the rubble. Jim was always willing to show up. At church, as I told you, he has worked with our babies and toddlers in our Kinderwatch every Sunday morning for close to 20 years. He sits in his favorite rocking chair every Sunday and simply delights in the creation God has the pleasure of giving to us in the form of our youngest children. He always answered the phone, even in church. He had a barking ring on his phone. So just in case he had an emergency, or that's what he blamed it on anyway, he always just, hello, right in church. But he took that Kinderwatch job just as seriously as he took being a paramedic and a college professor. And he took it much more seriously since the strokes left him no other choice but to retire from the Sterling Fire Department, which was a sad day in his life. He gave his money away lavishly with no need for thanks, to the church, to causes he supports, to the Deacons Fund and anonymous envelopes full of cash. He even sponsors several children from those Save the Children commercials in the 80s and still sends them money monthly. Jim was always willing to show up. Jim gave his love away lavishly, adopting his wife's first child from her first marriage when he was a toddler and raising him as his own, in addition to the children they had together. He took care of Robin in every way, as he promised in his marriage vows. He worked beyond retirement to put Lily through graduate school. He worried when he retired that his tithe to the church would have to be lowered, and he came to me worrying that I would suffer as a result. Sometimes I think he worked as long as he could also to keep his beloved church afloat. He took care of everyone, but his family most of all, and in the end, they got to return the favor. So, are you ready? You're like pointing and talking about me, but I want to talk to you now. Carl, Beth, Lily, Kevin, Edward, Eleanor, and Ingrid, are you back there somewhere? I see you. I'm so proud of you and so proud of who you are. I'm so lucky to know you. I'm so lucky to have accompanied you on this journey. Carl has the same instinct Jim does to save lives, and he came into the hospital and advocated for his father's wishes at the end of his life using the language and negotiating skills that he learned in medical school and as a medical doctor, which saved his mom's life in that week, his final gift to his mom and dad while his beloved father lay dying. And then Carl eulogized Jim carefully and with great love. I'm sure in Carl's way he researched how to give a good eulogy, making sure it was under 10 minutes and the exact right word count. But he showed up, as Jim taught him how to show up. And Lily saved her mother's life. She came to the hospital, stood by her mom, climbed into bed with her dad, covered him with 1,000 sweet kisses, probably annoying him, but he couldn't talk. Stood by her mother's side, sleeping with her in the same bed so that she wouldn't have to be alone. She prayed over him and told him she loved him about 1,000,000 times. I watched. She was strong at the broken places for her mom. She showed up. Jim taught her to show up. And then my time with Jim's wife, the other Robin, has been especially precious to me these past 2 weeks. She is a woman of valor. She did not want to let him go so soon, but she had the strength to just the same. She learned from Jim that this too is a gift, this last loving act of living out her marriage vows by respecting his wishes to die with dignity, to tell him that it is okay to go even though it is not okay at all. She prayed over him with grace, with compassion, with forgiveness for all that went wrong, and with gratitude for all that went right over the course of their beautiful, hard, complex, sometimes heartbreaking, and more often healing lives together. We sang How Great Thou Art, even though Jim always told Robin she couldn't sing. He was wrong. She can sing. And her voice joined with ours. She showed up. Jim taught her to show up too. Even as Jim slowly ran out of all of his speech, he could still say every time the doctors asked him, "Who is this lovely woman?" This is Robin, my wife, as opposed to Robin, my minister. Who is that man sitting over there? That is Dr. Carl M. Harper, my son. Jim couldn't smile because his left side no longer worked, but he could still beam with pride. Over there, that is where my treasure is, and that is where my heart is also. St. Francis, patron saint of the animals, said, "Keep a clear eye toward life's end. Do not forget your purpose and destiny as God's creature. What you are in his sight is what you are and nothing more. Remember that when you leave this earth, you can take nothing that you have received, but only what you have given, a full heart enriched by honest service, love, sacrifice, and courage." Jim remembered that he was God's creature. His life was lived in service to the love of God. Ecclesiastes says, "I know that whatever God does endures forever, and Jim's works on the earth will endure forever." Dr. James S. Harper III, well done, good and faithful servant. Amen.